You finished a 2-hour work session and somehow feel like you accomplished almost nothing. The documents were open. The emails were answered. You were technically busy the entire time. But when you sit back and think about what actually got done at a deep level, the answer is surprisingly thin. That feeling is not just frustration. It is a symptom of something happening inside your brain that most people never get explained to them clearly. The assumption most people carry is that doing more things at once means getting more done. It feels logical on the surface. If you can respond to messages while finishing a report while listening to a podcast, you're covering more ground. You're being efficient. But the brain does not work that way. And the cost of operating under this assumption is not just lost productivity in a single afternoon. The cost is structural. Over time, constant multitasking changes how your brain allocates attention. And those changes do not simply reverse themselves when you finally sit down to focus. This is what the research actually shows. And this is what most productivity conversations never fully explain. Multitasking does not just divide your attention in the moment. It gradually trains your brain to prefer shallow processing. It makes depth uncomfortable. It makes sustained focus feel almost neurologically foreign. Understanding why this happens requires looking at how the brain manages attention at a fundamental level, because once you understand the mechanism, the behavior starts to make complete sense. The brain has a system called the prefrontal cortex that handles what researchers refer to as executive function. This includes planning, decision-making, holding information in working memory, and controlling where attention is directed. Think of it as the brain's operating system for complex thinking. When you work on a single task that requires a real cognitive effort, the prefrontal cortex coordinates resources and keeps them pointed in one direction. That coordination is what produces depth. That is what allows an idea to develop fully, a problem to get solved at its root, or a piece of writing to actually say something meaningful. When you introduce a second task, the brain does not split perfectly in half and run both tasks simultaneously. What actually happens is that the prefrontal cortex begins switching. It drops context from one task, shifts resources, picks up the other task, processes briefly, then switches back. This switching happens quickly enough that it can feel continuous, but it is not. Each switch carries a cognitive cost that researchers call the switch cost. That cost shows up as slower processing, more errors, and reduced depth of thinking. Your brain is spending energy on the transition itself rather than on the actual work. Here is where it gets more significant. Dopamine plays a central role in why multitasking feels rewarding, even though it is neurologically expensive. Every time you switch to a new input, whether it is a notification, a new tab, a different conversation thread, your brain registers a small burst of novelty. Novelty triggers dopamine release. Dopamine does not just create pleasure. It reinforces behavior. It teaches the brain that the action that produced it was worth doing. So every time you switch tasks and feel that tiny hit of stimulation, your brain is quietly learning that switching is good. It is recording the pattern. It is building a preference. This is the loop that makes multitasking self-reinforcing. It is not just a bad habit in the way that leaving dishes in the sink is a bad habit. It is a neurochemically rewarded pattern. The brain is being told repeatedly and consistently that shifting attention is productive and stimulating. Meanwhile, staying on one thing for a long period starts to feel dull by comparison. Not because the work is actually less interesting, but because sustained focus does not deliver that same rhythm of dopamine hits. The brain has been conditioned to expect stimulation at a certain frequency, and deep, single-task work does not provide that frequency. This is why people who have spent years multitasking often describe a specific kind of restlessness when they try to sit down and do one thing. They open a document, and within 3 minutes feel an almost physical pull to check something else. That pull is not weakness. That pull is a trained neural response. The brain is doing exactly what it was taught to do through thousands of repeated reinforcements. It is seeking the stimulation pattern it learned to expect. Research conducted at Stanford by Clifford Nass and his colleagues revealed something that surprised even the researchers themselves. They expected heavy multitaskers to show some kind of cognitive advantage, some skill or compensatory ability that justified their behavior. What they found was the opposite. Heavy multitaskers were actually worse at filtering irrelevant information. They had more difficulty ignoring distractions. Their working memory was less organized. And perhaps most striking, they were slower at switching between tasks than people who multitasked less frequently. The very thing they practiced constantly, they were worse at. That finding tells you something important about what was actually happening in their brains. What was happening is that their attention systems had been softened. The neural pathways associated with filtering out irrelevant stimuli had been underused. The brain tends to strengthen what it uses and allow what it does not use to weaken. This is called synaptic pruning, and it is one of the core principles of neuroplasticity. The brain reshapes itself around repeated patterns. If the repeated pattern is scattering attention across multiple streams, the brain begins to structure itself for exactly that. It becomes optimized for breadth at the expense of depth. This creates what might be called a shallow focus ceiling. A person with this neural pattern can process a large volume of information, but they struggle to go deep into any single piece of it. They can skim 15 articles but cannot sit with one long enough to let the ideas fully form. They can draft 5 emails but cannot spend 45 minutes developing a single, complex argument. The brain has reorganized itself around a specific mode of processing, and that mode is inherently surface level. The modern environment does not help this process resist itself. The digital world is architecturally designed to reinforce exactly this pattern. Social media platforms, notification systems, email inboxes, news feeds, and messaging apps are all built around the same core mechanic, delivering a continuous stream of small varied inputs at unpredictable intervals. Unpredictability is critical here, because unpredictable rewards produce stronger dopamine responses than predictable ones. This is the same principle that makes slot machines psychologically compelling. You do not know when the reward is coming, so your attention stays primed and alert, waiting. Every time you check your phone and find something new, the pattern is reinforced. Every time you switch tabs and find a message, the behavior is rewarded. The environment is functioning like a training system, and it is training the brain toward exactly the kind of shallow, fragmented attention that makes sustained focus increasingly difficult over time. Most people are not choosing distraction so much as they are responding to a system that was specifically engineered to capture and redirect attention. What does this mean for identity? This is an aspect of the problem that rarely gets discussed in productivity conversations, but it matters enormously. When a behavior becomes a repeated pattern, it eventually gets absorbed into how a person understands themselves. Someone who has spent years operating in a distracted, fragmented way does not just have a focus problem. They begin to experience deep work as something that is simply not for them. They start to believe that they are not the kind of person who can sit and think for an hour without interruption. That belief then shapes the choices they make, which reinforces the neural pattern further. This is a behavioral loop with an identity layer on top. The multitasking reshapes the brain. The reshaped brain struggles with sustained focus. The struggle gets interpreted as a personal inability, and the identity of being a distracted person gets locked in. Breaking out of that loop requires addressing not just the behavior, but the underlying belief that the behavior has generated. The brain can change. Neuroplasticity works in both directions. The same mechanism that allowed multitasking to reshape attention systems also allows those systems to be reshaped toward depth. But that process requires understanding that the current state is a learned pattern, not a fixed trait. The practical path forward is not about forcing yourself to focus through sheer willpower. That approach fails because it treats the symptom rather than the mechanism. Willpower is a finite resource that gets depleted through use. And trying to override a deeply trained neural response with willpower alone is fighting the architecture of your own brain. What actually works is restructuring the environment and gradually rebuilding the neural patterns associated with sustained attention. This means working with the brain's natural rhythms rather than against them. The brain can maintain high-quality focused attention in blocks of roughly 45 to 90 minutes before cognitive resources begin to deplete significantly. Working in those blocks with deliberate single-task focus allows the prefrontal cortex to sustain coordination without the disruption of context switching. Over time, as the brain experiences sustained focus repeatedly, it begins to rebuild tolerance for it. The discomfort of staying on one thing diminishes as the neural pathways associated with depth are strengthened through use. Reducing the density of environmental triggers also matters at a neurological level. Every notification that appears in your peripheral awareness consumes a portion of attentional resource, even if you do not consciously act on it. The brain registers it, processes whether it requires a response, and uses cognitive resources in that evaluation. Removing those triggers does not just make it easier to focus in an obvious behavioral sense. It reduces the frequency of dopamine-driven interruptions that the brain has learned to anticipate, which gradually recalibrates the expectation pattern. There is also a quality of attention that needs to be rebuilt, not just a duration of it. Shallow focus is characterized by monitoring multiple inputs at a low level of engagement. Deep focus is characterized by committing cognitive resources fully to a single input at a high level of engagement. Learning to distinguish between those two modes in real time and consciously choosing to enter deep mode when the work requires it is itself a skill. It is one that feels effortful at first because the brain has been operating almost entirely in shallow mode. But effort and discomfort in early stages of building a new pattern are normal signals of neural reconfiguration, not indicators that the attempt is failing. What this all points toward is a fundamental truth about attention that the modern environment actively obscures. Focus is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a neurological capacity that gets shaped by how it is used. The brain you are working with today reflects the patterns it has been trained on, often without your conscious awareness or consent. The overstimulation of modern digital life, the architecture of apps built to fragment attention, the cultural normalization of multitasking as a professional virtue, all of these have been quietly shaping the way your brain processes the world. Understanding that is not meant to produce helplessness. It is meant to produce clarity. Because once you understand that your current attentional pattern is a trained response rather than a fixed reality, you gain something genuinely important. You gain the recognition that a different pattern is possible. The brain that learned to scatter its attention across 10 things at once can also learn to gather that attention and hold it steadily on one thing at a time. That process takes consistency and time because that is how neural patterns change. But it begins with understanding what actually happened and why. The question worth sitting with is not how to become more productive. The question is what kind of thinking you are actually capable of when your brain is not constantly managing the noise. That kind of thinking is still available to you. Simply requires rebuilding the conditions under which it naturally emerges.